Welcome to the ZoomInfo Labs podcast. I'm Ben Salzman.
And I'm Millie Beetham.
Today, we're excited to feature a very special guest, ZoomInfo's very own Chief Revenue Officer, James Roth.
James has had a remarkable career, starting in door-to-door sales in the summer heat of Washington, D.C., to leading revenue at a public company at the forefront of the industry. He shares valuable lessons he's learned along the way about leadership, grit, and the evolving role of technology in sales. We also deep dive into how AI is shaping go-to-market strategies at ZoomInfo and beyond. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the ZI Labs podcast. This is going to be a very special episode because we have our very own James Roth, the CRO of ZoomInfo, on the pod. James, great to see you.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, man. Long time coming. Hard to schedule you, I'll tell you, for being so close by. Pretty difficult to get on your calendar, but that's okay.
It is a challenging calendar, and for that I apologize. I wish we could have done it in person, but this will have to do.
Yes, no, this is great. We're very excited to have you on. Well, we're going to talk a lot about your background and sort of some of the things that helped you become you. We want to talk about your management principles and some of the things that you've done at ZoomInfo and where you want to take the revenue org and the company. And then we want to hear a lot about sort of early responses to Copilot and things that you're learning from sort of this new era of AI, which obviously is changing everyone's life, but in go-to-market as well. But first, let's start. What was James Roth like as a kid and sort of transitioning into your sort of university years?
Yeah. Believe it or not, I was a middle child and I was a complete introvert. It's funny to say now, given that I talk so much for a living, but I was incredibly shy. I had an outspoken, very loud older brother, and then I had a younger sister, and I was totally fine with being just the quiet middle child. Very shy. I was a big video game player. And so, I remember when I was going into seventh grade, we were going through the interview process at these different schools, and my old man was like, "Oh, he's a man of few words." And so it was this whole, I was very shy, I was very quiet. And my happy place was just basically going up to my room, playing video games. This is also when video games were not live with a headset, talking to other people. This was just, PlayStation 2.
Blowing the game, when it's fuzzy, the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a kid, super shy, introvert, and I doubt anybody that taught me in middle school or early high school would have thought that I would basically talk for a living. I definitely came out of my shell a bit in high school when I learned that I was, I wanted to be a good athlete, and so I was a good football player, and ultimately that took me down a very different path. And I always tell my kids, it's a very long game and you're not going to know really who you are until a certain period of time. And I just so happened to hit a growth spurt, and I was very big as a high schooler. And so I was a lineman on the football team. That really took me out of my shell, sort of the teammates and just getting loud and all that kind of stuff. And so, that really changed the trajectory that I was on, where I probably would have stayed an introvert gamer. And so ended up taking that to the next level, played in college, and I was a very different person. I think if you were to ask my middle school friends versus my college friends, I definitely, was a late bloomer in terms of social and everything else like that. But played football in college, and I then took another right turn after I graduated college, and I was a professional musician for a period of time, which actually led me into sales. So yeah, man, I'm happy to go deep on any one of those chapters, and they're very different chapters.
Yeah. And look, I'll say, having known you for a couple of years now, you don't have to be one person. I can tell, because you are both the CRO of a big public company and someone who will play a piano at an expert level in a public place still to this day. I've seen it a couple of times. So, you're more than one guy.
It went, I think for the right reasons, it went from a profession to a parlor trick.
Okay.
And it's much better as a parlor trick.
Yeah.
So
Fair enough.
I'll always try to keep a couple of crowd favorites at the ready in case that situation comes up. Ultimately, I think I started having the realization. I had this moment. There was guys at Amherst that were seniors when I was a freshman, unbelievably talented, great musicians, and they'd been basically living in a van for 4 years. And there was a picture that came up on, I think it was Facebook at the time, and they were at one of their friends' weddings, and they had the long hair, and they had like the thrift store suits. And I was like, I don't really know if I want to do that, want to be that. I was still very competitive. And so I thought maybe I could get the best of both worlds, and I could start more of a corporate job by day and then be a wannabe rock star at night. So I started interviewing for like tech sales companies out in LA. And there was a company that had a pretty big branch location. It was called CBeyond, and it was out in LA. And I was going through the interview process, and they said, hey, we just launched an office in your hometown where you grew up in Washington, D.C. You could be like employee number 5 out there, and it would be, they're definitely looking to hire folks there. And I had this moment, luckily got some good mentorship from my old man at the time. And he said, hey, don't do that, because you're just going to be mediocre at both. Like, the guys in the band are going to hate you because you're not working with them during the day, practicing, writing, blah, blah, blah. And then during the day, you're never going to focus or go all in on being a great sales guy, because you're going to think, I'm going to go be a rock star at night. And so it was really good advice. And at that point in time, I cut the hair and I moved back to the East Coast, and I started my official sales job. And that was when I went from being a professional to a parlor trick.
And I still think there's room for a professional musician. I'm still holding out hope for you.
It's pretty funny just because it was not a standard track. And especially when you think about Amherst and all this other stuff, like, you had to have the right internship, and then you had to do this, and then you had to know somebody on Wall Street. And then, it was very much this like ultra type A linear progression. And so there was a host of people that were like, oh, Roth's a crazy person. Like, he's in LA and he's trying to be a musician. And so, I starting in sales after that, it was, I think, the biggest takeaway. And the thing that started to drive me somewhat crazy as a musician is that crossroads of like talent and hard work. It did not equate, like, the amount of luck. Everything requires luck, but the amount of luck that it took there. And when you had people that were unbelievably talented, and you had, working and gigging and doing all that stuff, and then they're still 10, 15, 20 years later, didn't catch that stroke of luck. That is where I ultimately got into and loved sales, was because it was like, if you're talented and you work at it and you put in more than other people, like, it was the most linear equation being successful.
Yeah, I love it. And so let's talk more about those early years. You shared, before, that your early days were really, truly knocking on doors. What was the first few years of your sales career like? And maybe start to share how that contrasts with the world that we live in now.
Yeah, so I might be one of the only Amherst graduates that went into door-to-door sales after graduation, but I did. And so the first job, CBeyond, was like a managed service, sort of telco, cloud services, kind of like an all-in-one at the time. For small and mid-sized businesses, it was primarily just the local providers, whether it was Verizon, Comcast, et cetera. And they had carved out a really successful niche of like, data storage, backup, recovery, hosted services, website services, like basically all in IT, cloud, business in a box. And they would send out entry-level college grads to go knock on doors around businesses in their local markets. And so, I started, I got the 2-week training, and I got a site seller, and I got a territory. And my first territory was actually the murder capital of Washington, D.C. at the time. It had the highest crime rate in any sort of D.C. area. And so they actually would not put females in that territory because it was so dangerous. And we were like a suit and tie culture. So you dress up in your suit and tie, you'd go out there with your site seller and your laptop, and you would knock on small to mid-sized businesses.
And what's a site seller?
A site seller was a binder that had laminated pages that was basically your pitch.
Is it a phone book? I think they call that a phone book.
No, it was not a phone book.
Okay.
It was, I still remember it because you had to learn how to use it. You would sit down, and this was, again, you did have a laptop, but it was just, you had this site seller, and it was a binder, and there was like 12 laminated pages, and it was like, hey, Ben, here's page 1. Here's our company story. Here's page 2. This is our founder, blah, blah, blah. Here's page 3. And so you would go through, and it was like sort of it was the way that you could take a 22-year-old and just, even if they were terrible at selling, if they just got through that site seller, they could potentially be successful. And it was like a heavy attrition, as you'd imagine. You'd hire 80 people in a month. And if 5 to 10 of them stuck around, they built a really good business that way. They IPO'd, and we ultimately sold that business. I was there 6 years. I started as a sales rep. I got promoted to a manager, and then I promoted to a director, and promoted to running the region. And it was a great place to learn and grow and develop and really hone in on that heavy sales first culture. And I think, a lot of folks from there have gone off to be very successful. And I always joke, I talked to a guy this morning, actually, that was started there. And, it gives you a level of grit that I think a lot of people today don't have.
I love that it was still bad targeting data that got you and ended up in a skiff, off of bad data about where this company's located. It's like still the challenge that some of the customers before they come to ZoomInfo have today. So it's interesting that it's like a different format than the laminated binder. It comes through a little more high fidelity.
Well, when you talk about go-to-market efficiency, and you hire 22-year-olds that have never done sales before, and you send them out to a territory with nothing. No intelligence, no information, just knock on doors that look like businesses. I always joke, it was like when we did ultimately buy Discover.org and ZoomInfo, probably 5-6 years later, it was like inventing the wheel, where it's like, wait, I actually have an idea of who's in this building. I actually know that it's a government agency that's going to potentially shoot me when I walk in. And then, our pitch, one of the big things we trained on is getting past the gatekeeper. You would walk in, you would have no idea who you were asking for. You didn't know if there was an owner, if there was an IT person, if there was a president. You didn't know if this was a branch location for a Fortune 100 company. You knew nothing. And so you basically had to walk up to the receptionist, gatekeeper, secretary, whatever they were, with no idea who they were and no idea who you were asking for. And you would basically say, hi, I'm here to speak with whoever handles your IT. Tell them James is here. And then you would turn around and walk away. That was the training. And we always joked, it was just like, hey, I don't know your name, Ben, and I'm here to talk to whoever handles the IT work. And you walk away. And that was the training. And so, yeah, in a world now, especially to the hardest jobs ever, where, the amount of technology, and you think of a ZoomInfo, where you have an SDR that knows exactly who to reach out to, when to reach out, why you're reaching out at that point in time, what technologies they have in their tech stack. Like, I mean, it's a dream come true. I would love to wake up and be an SDR at this point in time, because It's so much easier than what so many of us had to go through.
Absolutely. And look, you've basically surpassed me and outshined me ever since, but it makes me feel lucky. For my first SDR job, I was sitting in a comfortable office chair at Oracle with, albeit a shitty CRM and shitty data, but, inside and safe, no less. So that's a great story. And you then, ended up spending time at Vonage as a ZoomInfo customer. Share more about that experience and how, Vonage evolved while you were there. Obviously, you clearly helped build it up and exit the company.
Yeah. So I actually, when I left, so CBeyond sold to a company called Birch, and they were basically rolling up a bunch of providers that did something similar. And so that acquisition took place, and I actually stayed through most of that. And then once I realized that their core goal for that company was to kind of do less cloud stuff. Like, what brought me into it is that cloud back in that day was like the new cool technology. And they really wanted to sell off the cloud businesses and really lean into the telco side, which for me was, not as interesting. And so at that point, there was a regional competitor of ours that had a very similar but more heavy cloud-based value proposition. And I know them because we'd compete with them. I knew their CEO, I knew their president, and they were a relatively small company at the time. They were regional. They had headquarters in Tysons Corner, Virginia, and then they had a branch location in Baltimore. And so I had seen a bunch of people make a bunch of money at CBON because they had this great IPO, then they had this sale. And I started later in the game as a relatively low-level employee. So I said, you know what? Like, I could start earlier in the journey and, hopefully have a similar sort of outcome that those folks did. So I started at this company, iCore Networks. Again, very similar cloud, sort of a managed service cloud offering across all things you would need in an office, but more upmarket. And so I started there, basically running sales. And, their big thing is they wanted to grow from a regional player to a more national player. So we launched a bunch of offices. And so I was traveling a ton. Luckily at the time I was still young. I was 26, 27 and, not married, no kids. And so I was literally doing Sunday through Friday in some of these different markets, launching these offices. And so we ultimately, once we got to a more national footprint, we sold to Vonage. And so Vonage, for those that don't know, Vonage, they had this wonderful home office, home phone provider. A lot of really catchy commercials in the 2000s. And so they had this great business. It spit off $1 billion of free cash flow every year. But I'm sure nobody on this call right now has a home phone line. And so as the iPhone started getting traction in 2008, and then you have this generation that doesn't really need a landline anymore, their growth basically stopped. But despite having no growth, they still had this $1 billion of free cash flow. They're a public company. So their stock price basically fell to almost nothing, but they still had $1 billion in free cash flow. And so they started acquiring more enterprise communication platform companies. So we were the third of their 14 acquisitions in probably a 3-year run. And so they bought Twilio's biggest competitor, a company called Nexmo. They bought a competitor of Five9's and InContact in the cloud contact center space. Called New Voice Media, which was an early Salesforce venture investment. It was basically a cloud contact center built in and built on Salesforce. And so the goal was to be this end-to-end communication platform. So we were, think on the unified communication side, you were RingCentral's biggest competitor, you were a contact center competitor, and then you were Twilio's biggest competitor. And so we built that business and, essentially had $0 in business revenues, and they were all on the consumer side. And then we took it to over $1 billion in business revenues, and we ultimately sold it in Q4 of 2021, thankfully. Q4 of 2021 was a way better time to sell anything from a valuation standpoint. And so, yeah, I think it was, a lot of times people will talk about like having a run. And I don't mean that from like a financial standpoint or anything else, but like staying someplace and really learning all aspects of leadership. The run that I had at CBON, it was great, motivating reps and sort of building out territories and going to market. Like that was good. But at Vonage, being a much bigger company and being so diverse in terms of the different products, and we were international, the run really more so on like the learning and development. And so, going from like, yes, I can run a sales team. Yes, I can motivate and inspire a sales team. Yes, I can go drive a number. But there were so many additional things like, okay, on the business side, like FP&A, what is gross margin versus contribution margin on our channel business? Like there was just a wealth of really smart people that over an 8-year stint at Vonage, I just got to learn constantly.
And you probably still carry that over to your hiring today. Like when you're hiring, you're looking for people who've gone through some sort of, a more difficult period, or just maybe touch on that for a second if you could.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we obviously have great people from the great companies here today at ZoomInfo, Salesforce, Oracle, Microsoft. And so again, it's not to diminish that, but in the interview process, I think it is just, you have to be super clear on kind of like what periods of time were you there for? And then, just leaning into has this person had to do it when it was hard? And I think that is something that is difficult because, again, it's been such a crazy kind of 10 years in tech or 10 years in sales, where you go through these different paradigm shifts that maybe once took a decade that now takes 6 months. And so you have people like, do they lean into new technologies? Are they curious around new technologies? Are they very set in their ways? And I think from a sales perspective, you have some of the most set in their ways people. And so making sure, like, show me how, like, what's in your current tech stack? How do you use it? And you'll find out quickly if somebody's one of these, like, oh, I don't even open my laptop. I'm doing business on the golf course. There's obviously a time and place for that. But I think there's a lot that you can learn in the actual interview process to say, like, has this person been through a challenging environment? And when you look at the percentage of the population, especially in sales and SDRs, that started like post-pandemic, where all they've known is remote work, all they knew is, 2/3 of their career is when it was really easy. Are they going to be able to get through what is a challenging time? Do they know how to motivate teams through a challenging time? Or is their leadership just based on, everything is just up and to the right all the time and we'll promote you and we'll give you more money? Like I've always said, that's a really cheap, easy way to lead. And there's a lot of companies that ultimately never had to learn how to lead people through difficult times. And a lot of folks are figuring that out right now. And in a time where you can't always promote everybody and you can't always pay them a lot of money, or their RSUs might not be worth what they used to be, there's so many other aspects of leadership that can help people get through those times where it's like, what are you learning? What aspects are you developing that can help you get to the next level versus just easy sales, easy money?
Yeah, fantastic. And look, kudos to you. You grinded it out in LA on the streets, performing in Southeast, knocking on doors, through a tough period at Vonage. So, maybe that is a good bridge into your time at ZoomInfo is a whole nother round of learnings around AI. Like the rest of us, you're probably ramping up on it every day and over the last 2 years. What are some of the ways that you've been impacted, or your org has been impacted by AI productivity? And then more importantly, our customers, what are some of the impacts you're seeing from AI into their go-to-market?
Yeah, I mean, I think like any major shift or any big technological revolution, I think you have this first period, which is just a lot of noise and a lot of people talking about it. And, I won't use names, but there are certain folks, even in our organization, and I use this example, we've got a top rep. And, one of the things that we'll do is they'll write up a note and they'll have me send it to the executives at certain companies. And, I was like, hey, throw that into ChatGPT and shorten it, because sometimes they'll write these just manifestos. And this is, again, a younger, really good rep. And he's like, what do you mean throw it into ChatGPT? And I'm like, you don't use that? And so you have this almost false sense of everybody's using it. Everybody knows what it means. Everybody uses it all the time. And so I say that with like the first period of the transformation, you have people that talk about it. They think they know what it means, but they really don't. In a business sense, I also think that's the case. And you see the AI practices for Bain and McKinsey and Deloitte, and they're just crushing it because people want to demystify what AI really means. What are the actual use cases for it? And so I think if I'm looking at the curve, we're probably still very early days, and a lot of folks know that they should be using it. They know that they should be doing something with it, and the early adopters and the folks that are really leaned into it are. But I think the more they get to that sort of how do we really use this thing outside of some of the gimmicky use cases, that's where I think the fun is. And so I get to have this conversation with companies big and small, Fortune 500, Fortune 100, but also a 100-person company, down market. And I think they're all trying to solve very similar use cases. And I think what it comes to, and I've sat through the sessions with the big consulting firms, and I've sat through the sessions with some of our biggest customers, is you have these amazing use cases that can be done very quickly and done at scale. But it always comes back to like, what is the underlying data foundation? And I don't say that to try to shamelessly promote ZoomInfo. I say it because as you go to any of these great use cases that can be done, especially in go-to-market, if it's just based on your CRM data, and most people will say your CRM data is wrong, or if it's just based on third-party data, and obviously third-party data, there's a whole world of it. if you are not focused on making that underlying data asset correct, up to date, and right across first party conversations, emails, third party, you're going to have a bunch of use cases that don't land. And I feel like we're at that point where the early people, and there's so much noise on this topic, but it's just like, oh, like AI is not worth all the, the only people making money on AI are the hyperscalers and the NVIDIAs of the world. Nobody's really figured out how to monetize it. And I think they're starting to realize that really to get the usage or get the real bang for your buck in AI, you've got to have great data underlying it, irrespective of the use case.
James, talk to us a little bit about how some of the use cases have manifested internally. What have you been most surprised about around the use cases for your own team?
I guess let me start with internally. As a data first company, I think one of the things that it's really unlocked for us is the ability to consume huge amounts of data and then consolidate that into very specific go-to-market specific, this is what we really need from all of this data. So if you think about things like earnings calls, 10Ks, 10Qs, that is a wonderful data asset that if you're a salesperson and you open up a 10K saying, I'm going to be a great enterprise seller, I'm going to read this 10K end to end. You get through it, half of it doesn't make sense, half of it are charts you've never seen before, and you start to get intimidated by it. And so the ability to consolidate and consume an entire 10K in an instant and then train it to give you the most important, the most relevant things for go-to-market, I mean, that's a huge game changer, both internally and externally. I think about podcasts like this one, the ability to take what is a terabyte of podcast information. There's a ton of podcasts out there, and kudos to ZoomInfo Labs podcast for being in the top. But no one is going to sit there and listen to all of the content. If they have a meeting with me, the odds that they're going to go listen to a bunch of the podcasts that I've done, you have this risk reward in sales. How much time am I going to put in to becoming an expert on ZoomInfo, becoming an expert on James, becoming an expert on all these things? Am I going to take 10 hours to consolidate and consume all that information? And then I have a 30-minute meeting with James where none of it really lands? And so I feel like salespeople in general kind of lean out of that. And they're like, and again, they're also salespeople. We all got into it for a reason. Most of them because they didn't love reading a 500-page.
Totally. They'd rather be dropped back into Southeast than to read the whole 10K, right?
Totally. And a lot of them sort of learn on the fly, and they're going to get by on their charm and charisma. And so, again, all of that aside, that is probably the most powerful internal use case for us, not only equipping our sellers to be instantly prepared for these types of meetings, but then also in a data collection and data aggregation standpoint, our ability to bring new data assets into our platform at a speed which we'd never done before is a really interesting use case where, we've got firmographic data, we've got contact data, but also now psychographic data where we can say like, yeah, if we had to have 300 researchers that were just listening to podcasts saying, okay, Ben Salzman, he likes to play basketball, you're never going to do that. And so now the speed with which we can take what is a unique data asset, basically take all of the relevant information out of it, put it into the platform so that you can have salespeople that are more equipped or marketing teams that are more equipped to get the things right. Obviously, conversational intelligence is another big one. When we first deployed Chorus, and you have all of this, this sort of pie in the sky, like, oh, Ben's going to listen to all of these different calls. Like the odds that you as a busy executive are going to go listen to a 40-minute call to see how your rep is doing or to see how the call went, it's not going to happen. Maybe once in a blue moon, and usually the only time is going to be if somebody botches a call and their senior executive reaches out to you and says,
if I'm listening to a whole call, something went really wrong these days, right?
Yes. And so the ability to amalgamate that at scale and get the relevant nuggets out of it, those use cases are amazing.
Yeah. And most companies, to your point, are still at the starting line on this, right? I think we've had at least 50 or 75 use cases internally, like the ones you talked about, call coaching, and HR bots, and all kinds of things that it just feels like, again, most people sort of haven't yet actually used it at work. They sort of talk about it a little bit over cocktails, but never go deeper.
And listen, what I would say on that front, and it's interesting and it'll be a recurring theme, and I know I don't want to jump another section, but in terms of that, like what I've learned in the workplace, whether it's leadership or otherwise, is that what holds so many people, individuals, companies, et cetera, back is that the natural human tendency is to shy away from what they don't know. And you've got all this noise in the Thunderdome where it's like, oh, focus on your strengths, focus on your strengths. And I don't disagree with focus on your strengths, but I think that there's a lot of folks in orgs today doing their companies a disservice, because if you came up in a non-AI world and you have that, whether it's imposter syndrome or insecurity or whatever you want to call it, and they kind of shy away from it because they look at it as like, oh, I'm not an AI expert and I got to make sure that my thing here is like my job security. And it's such a miss. And I see it across every role, every company, every group, is that you've got this small percentage of people that are totally willing to be like, I am a dummy when it comes to this. And I'm going to go talk to Ben because he's a really smart guy and he gets it. And I know that at some point I'm going to need to get this.
It's like beginner's mindset, right? Just like really taking it from the top, right?
100%. And so like, I remember when I first started at ZoomInfo, I had not been, in like the data go-to-market space before. I knew ZoomInfo really well because I deployed it to a lot of the teams I had. But we had this product, it was called DaaS, Data as a Service. And it was like large scale data into Snowflake, into Databricks. Like, you have our end user platform and then you have data as a service, which is basically just like all of our data. And I didn't know what it was. And so we had a gentleman, Amit, and I've talked about this on past podcasts, where I literally in my first couple of weeks, I rolled up on Amit and I said, hey, you're really smart. And the things that you say, I probably understand 15% of. And so I'm going to meet with you every day until I get to a point where I understand 60%. Then I'm going to meet with you every week until I get to the point where I understand 80%. And so that mindset, and I think it's really, really common, especially as you get further up the food chain, because, and again, I'm going to intermix a lot of stories here, because you get brought in. And when I got brought into ZoomInfo, there is this natural human tendency to be like, I'm the guy. I got brought in here because I know what I'm doing. And, rah, 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 rah. And it's just a strange feeling to come in and be like, I'm the dumbest guy in the room, especially when you get hired as like some big shiny guy. But I just have no problem doing that. And the story that I will tell, and I have told in the past, earlier in my career, previous company, they started hiring externally. So usually they would promote internally, sales rep becomes a manager, manager becomes a director, director becomes an MD, MD becomes a VP. And they started hiring from the outside. They brought in this guy, great guy, still dear friends with him today, and sort of old school telco guy. And he had his first 90 to 120 days. He was an external hire. He did a lot of the right things. First thing he did was ingratiate the leadership team. He's like, you guys are all underpaid. Here's a bunch of money. So of course I'm like, love this guy. But what I learned in terms of what not to do is he took that first 120 days, which are so critical for somebody new, and he played the like Mr. Corporate, sit in his office, pounding away at his keyboard. He did not take the time to like really meet the people, meet the customers, learn the product. And once he missed that runway where he could say, I'm the dumbest guy in the room right now, Roth, you've been here 3-4 years, like teach me. He took the opposite, which is like, I know it, I've been there, done that. This is like riding a bike for me and I'm doing big old corporate stuff, which he wasn't, by the way. There was no real corporate stuff to be done. That's always a myth. And so once he hit that 120-day mark, there's an expectation that this guy knows the product. He knows what he's doing. Like, hey, man, you want to come join me on a customer meeting? We have our biggest customer that wants a face-to-face because, we had an outage or something else like that. And he got to the point where because he didn't know product, customers, really much of anything, he then had to relegate himself even further into back office corporate stuff.
Because he's farther from the sort of the core of understanding the business.
And once you hit that threshold and there's an expectation that you should know, then you can no longer play the I'm the dumb guy card, teach me.
Yeah.
And so like missing that runway. And so I'll get back to the overall AI thing. I would say more often than not in my career, both talking to companies and seeing internally, that is not what most people are set to. They are set to, I've built this great thing. I do this great thing. I have my playbook that served me well at these last 5 companies. And I think that probably worked when the rate of innovation was way slower. Now, I think the people that will lead the way are the people that say, hey, yeah, this is what I've set up currently, but I know there's people out there. I know there's companies out there. I know there are things out there that are way better than what I have built here. So please talk to me.
That's fantastic. James, I love, my 2 biggest takeaways from this conversation for our listeners are, you made the point around if you can marry the hard work and the competency at the same time, sales and go-to-market is an incredible place to be. And I think you've taken a learning mindset and a patient mindset to these learnings that put you on the spot around competency. And then, to your credit, I see you show up every day early, stay late. You're one of the most committed, hardworking people that I've personally been around. So a credit to you and a big shout out to Griffey for letting us borrow you every weekday into perpetuity.
Yeah, man. Again, I think yes, and I think that the hard work and the commitment, if you look at it in a way where every single day you do get to pick something up. Like I look forward to getting in early. I look forward to basically everything that I get to do. And I think, again, just reiterating, like when people get to a certain level, I'm a manager now, like I've made it. And then you stop learning and then they become complacent and then everybody's seen it at every single level. And so like, do I expect everybody is going to be as committed in the office as early, working as hard? No, that's not my expectation. But I think if you can find a way to make that more fun and make it more of, again, the gold coins, where it's just like, if I get in early and I get to have one extra conversation with somebody like yourself or somebody like one of our customers where I get to pick that stuff up, you go from like dreading a day of back-to-back 14 hours of Zoom meetings, you go from dreading that to being like, you know what? I had lunch with a guy today. I wasn't quite sure why that lunch was set up. And when I went to the account team and I said, hey, I know they're a customer, but like, why are we doing lunch? And they're like, I'm not really sure. I could have been like, oh, I got to go do this lunch. But like, I'm like, this guy's got an unbelievably interesting background and I'm going to pick something up from that. And so I just go into every day, or like the board meeting. Nobody looks forward to a board meeting. Even if you've got great results, nobody looks forward to a board meeting. And so you got to gear yourself up to say, there's 14 really, really smart people in this room. I'm probably going to learn a ton of stuff. And even if it's a total head kicking, I'm going to come out of it with the experience of like, okay, what is a really tough board meeting or a closed door in? Like all of these things you get to do, irrespective of whatever role it is. I think if people can kind of flip that mindset into thinking this is going to be a really shitty day, into being like, and I'm not dumb enough to be like, oh, every day is a great day. And Ben, you know me well. I'm not one of those like, hooray, every day's a great day. It is a process and it is a rewiring of your brain, because there are going to be really shitty days. There are going to be really shitty months. But I think if you can rewire it to say like, I look forward to that shitty month, because I guarantee if I go about it the right way, I'm going to learn a ton of stuff from it. And I'm going to put that in the arsenal to then make sure I don't have another shitty month because of that thing. And so, yes. And Griffey, by the way, for those listening, that is my wife. It is not some weird like startup tech company called Griffey. And she is a great partner.
It's a great startup name, though. So let's not.
It's a good startup name. And yeah, I think having a good partner in crime, getting through whatever you're getting through, whether that's a friend, whether that's a significant other, whether that's a wife, a husband, et cetera. She's a huge cheerleader, and I appreciate that. She'll never listen to this, so I don't need to give her a shout out.
What are you talking about? We're holding on hope for that too. I'll send her the clips. James, this has been a really insightful conversation, and really love working with you every day and the impact that you've had on the business and me personally, and all the wisdom you've shared with our audience. So thank you so much for coming on the ZI Labs podcast, and we'll see you out there.
Yeah, Ben, thank you. Always a pleasure. And hopefully you can edit this to make it sound more coherent.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the ZoomInfo Labs podcast.
With new episodes dropping every Monday and Thursday, subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me and Ben on LinkedIn and visit zoominfo.com/labs to get in touch.